This is the Danger Close podcast, Beyond the Books with me, Jack Carr. Welcome to the Danger Close podcast, an Ironclad original presented by Sig Sauer. My guest today is Julian Rademeyer. Julian is the author of Killing for Profit, about the illicit trade of rhino horn, and is an investigative journalist, and currently is the director of the Organized Crime Observatory for East and Southern Africa at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. Fascinating guy, amazing book, love talking to him. Hope we can meet up in person one of these days. And now, without further ado, Julian Rademeyer. I'm so excited that we're getting to do this. So thank you for taking the time.
No, thank you. It's been great since that Instagram post a couple of years back.
That's right.
Yeah, and you were over here back then, I think. Yeah,
that's right. I think I was just getting back from one of my trips, but one of them was specific to help train up an anti-poaching unit, do as much as I could anyway. And it was fascinating because I learned so much more from them than they learned from me. They were just transitioning from the weapons they'd been using to some new ones that I had a background with. So just kind of helping them there. But their backgrounds and their stories and their lives were the most fascinating part of that trip for me. And I mean, they've stayed with me, and they were all older. That's what really got me, is some of those guys that were so much old. I mean, a lot of them were really old. They caught like the Bush Wars, tail end of the Bush Wars, and they'd worked for whatever the what National Police Force called, what in America we call like a CSI, crime scene investigation. Yeah. So they'd done that, and then they'd gotten scooped up by some of these private anti-poaching concessions out there. So their backgrounds were fascinating, but yours is too. That's why I kind of want to start with that. Like, how did you, what was your path into journalism? Was it something you always wanted to do, or did you study it in school, or how did you get to your, essentially your foot in the door and start down that path as a journalist?
Yeah, I think it was a weird thing. So I kind of grew up in South Africa in the 1980s. I was born in the 70s, kind of showing my age a bit, but grew up in the 1980s, and there was so much turmoil, there was so much change happening. 1985 was a particularly crazy year in South Africa. A lot of protest action going on, massive clampdowns from the military. And then as I moved into my final school years, you got the beginnings of change. So you've got the release of Nelson Mandela. You've got these winds of change blowing through not only South Africa but through the world. So you saw the wall coming down. All these seismic kind of changes. And I'd grown up in a family that had my dad was a history teacher, who had this sort of obsession with history, with telling stories. And that stuck with me. And I'd watched a lot of some of the very courageous reporting that had happened in South Africa in the 1980s in very difficult circumstances. And I aspired to do that kind of thing. And there were a lot of reporters. We went through really bad patch obviously in the 80s, but then also in the early 90s, in those beginning days of democracy, where ultimately it was a small civil war raging in the country, a lot of violence, a lot of killing, and reporters who put themselves out there to tell those stories. So that for me was really inspirational. Trying to get those stories down. And it grew from there. So I kind of left high school, started bumming around, trying to get a job, knocking on reporters' doors and irritating them. And eventually this guy took a bit of a shine to me, gave me, a job, paid me like $100 a month, and, to pack files. But ultimately I ended up writing stories and filing some of those stories with his help. And it moved from there. So becoming a freelancer and then moving into the newspaper industry and from there. Yeah.
Okay. So you started off, is it called freelance independent journalist, just working for different news organizations and then coming on as a staff reporter at certain news organizations? Was that your path?
Yeah, basically. I mean, back then it was kind of get a foot in the door, see, whatever options you could get. The nice thing, I struck it really lucky. So Reuters news agency, which, is one of the biggest news agencies in the world back then, there was so much going on that their correspondent in South Africa could only focus on some stuff. And she took a liking to me, reckoned that, I could potentially do some of this job. So I got a bit of an in there covering some of the stuff around police death squads that have been operating in the 1980s, some of the more extremist stuff that was happening around the fringes in those early days of democracy. And then ultimately ended up in working for newspapers, being employed by newspapers, and starting at the bottom like most journalists used to back then. You start off covering local government stuff, the courts. You become the sort of guy that lurks around in courtrooms, constantly covering those cases, and eventually build up, doing a bit of politics, and then ultimately it led to me doing investigations and working for an investigative unit, which took me in the path of looking at things like rhino poaching and organized crime.
Yeah. And so in the 90s, when all these changes are coming about, as a journalist, did you ever feel that you were in danger because of your reporting out there from different entities of the government or different supporters of different factions or that sort of a thing? How dangerous was it to be a journalist back then?
Look, I think for journalists in South Africa, and maybe our risk threshold is a bit higher than in some places where we live in a country where change is constant and where violence and violent protests are a fact of life. We have extremely high levels of crime in South Africa, very high levels of violent crime. So there are risks that you take, but there are risks that you try and deal with, and you try and ameliorate and find ways of handling those risks as best as you possibly can. So covering gang violence, covering political protests. You do find yourselves in situations, particularly when you're young and stupid, you do crazy things like going between sort of two groups of protesters and police on one side and trying to get the most dramatic picture, which leads to you being sort of shot with rubber bullets or tear gassed or whatever.
Yeah.
And it kind of, it was a badge of honor in those days for reporters who were coming up. But there were real risks involved. I mean, there were a number of photographers, particularly in the early 80s, who lost their lives. Ken Westerbroek, who was a particularly famous South African photographer, incredible photographer, who was killed in clashes between was the National Peacekeeping Force, who were trying to bring peace to township areas around South Africa. He got hit by a stray bullet. And there's a generation of photographers who grew out of that particular period who became conflict photographers around the world. Someone like Charles Silver, who is probably one of the best conflict photographers on the planet, worked for the New York Times for many years, still does. Sadly, lost his legs in a landmine explosion in Afghanistan, but continues to shoot, and has been through and has documented, what veterans have been through, has documented all sides of that conflict. So there were people back then who became that sort of breeding ground, particularly in the sort of late 80s, early 90s, which was a little bit before my time as a reporter.
Yeah. Did you ever feel that you were targeted because of what you're reporting, like outside of, say, going in to do the actual reporting, but hey, at home, just doing around your normal life outside of the profession, but hey, someone doesn't like what you're reporting on, this person needs to disappear. Was that ever something that you thought about?
Yeah, I mean, it's, again, it's a risk. I mean, there are a lot of people who threaten, and my general sort of feeling about that is that people who threaten are invariably trying to intimidate. They're unlikely to really take it much further. I mean, that's sort of some that potentially might not go the whole way. But it's the guys who don't threaten. And I've had one or two cases there. One guy was an arms dealer that I'd done some early reporting on, a South African guy who ended up in the Philippines, being based there, running a drug operation, running weapon smuggling operations, who at one stage hired, thankfully, probably the world's worst hitman to take a hit out of.
Really?
Which was, they were terrible. And they
what did they do?
No, well, they were, the one guy was an ex-cop. Actually, they were both ex-cops, but the one guy had a drug habit. The other guy had a marriage that was falling apart, and it was a complete mess. So ultimately, he was probably more likely to shoot his wife's new boyfriend than anyone else. And they kind of never really got to the point. They talked about it a lot, but they never really got to the point of doing anything. And they talked about it in the front of police, in front of police informants, which is I eventually found out about this kind of thing. So that probably was the biggest sort of close call in a way. And I mean, this was a guy who was quite dangerous. He's been linked to a number of murders. He almost gamified murders in a way. For him, he'd hire someone to go off and kill someone. It meant nothing to him because it was kind of, this guy is irritating me. Let me take them out. I mean, to the point where his estate agent in the Philippines, he felt that he'd been screwed over on a housing deal, and she was killed by hitmen that he hired. It was a really crazy story. He's currently in U.S. custody. He was arrested a couple of years ago by the DEA in Sierra Leone, and effectively taken back to the US and has become something of a cooperating witness on cases there. And his whole network is essentially unraveled. But he was quite a ruthless guy, to the point where he'd pull military veterans, US military veterans, into his wake and hire them to do jobs for him, and exploit these guys. And ultimately, in some cases, they ended up carrying the can for some of his activities.
You've met quite the cast of characters over your time in journalism, and you talk about a lot of them in here, just in this book. I mean, there's so many stories in here, and I mean, the writing is fantastic in here. But there a couple of times you referenced some things that you did unrelated to your investigation into Rhino, or just a touch point, or that kind of comes to the edge of it, like the what do you call the syndicates, or the tactic where these armored cars get hit, and sometimes very sophisticated, very violent means, with IEDs used to blow these things up and blow the doors, kill everybody involved, grabbing it. Like, what are those called in South Africa? They're very popular for a while.
Cash and transit heists.
Yeah, that's. I mean, we don't see it as much here in the States, and you see a lot of it though. And is it still something that goes on in South Africa?
Yeah, sadly, it's coming back, and because it's Christmas season, it's coming back with a vengeance. This is the time of year when that happens. Look, crime-wise, we're a pretty wild country. I mean, we have serious worrying levels of violent crime. We have a police force that has been utterly corrupted by years of maladministration, abuse. We have intelligence agencies which simply can't function, which have become political tools, and we've kind of lost the handle. I mean, if you look in the early days, sort of when cash and transit heists were really first becoming their thing in the 1990s, sort of probably a bit later, late 1990s to early 2000s. The police were really good at getting intelligence, at trying to target that. We had the police task force, which was an elite special forces type unit within the police. They were trained for hostage negotiation. They were trained for rapid response incidents. Who really kind of went in there. They were extremely professional, and they cracked down hard. And these syndicates got hammered. And what's interesting, and something I touch on in the book, is that some of those syndicates, because cash in transit became so difficult to carry out, because there was so much attention on it, because you were constantly having to face these risks of very heavily armed police, helicopters, the whole thing. Guys started moving to softer crimes like rhino poaching. Some of those syndicates. And it was kind of this displacement effect. We now at the situation where we've got cash and transit gangs coming back. You'll have guys in a couple of fast cars. I mean, there have been shootouts involving gangs of 30 guys on the highways, where they'll block a vehicle carrying cash carrying vehicle. There'll be a shootout. I think these days there's probably, it's still very violent, but fewer people get killed. There were, horrific cases where they'd burn guys out of cash vans. They'd get hold of explosives from the mining industry. That's a common source for explosives that are used in these things. And these are very sophisticated, very well armed gangs, AK-47s, and sometimes quite high explosives. They know what they're doing. They're very professional, and they go out and do it. And that extends currently into the mining industry. We now have, in the last couple of years, we've had a rash of incidents where guys are forcing their ways into smelters, gold smelters, crashing through fences in armored vehicles, taking out security, grabbing as much gold as they can and getting out there. So it's an ongoing thing. So these violent gangs, and look, I guess it's in some ways, if you look at South Africa, and that's a country where there's almost 50% unemployment. You're looking at a high level of people who are out there. How do you make a living? And illicit economies is many cases where you go.
South Africa's always been so fascinating to me, the entire history. But before you started writing this book, did you have and by the way, are you going to write some more books? Because your writing is incredible. It reads like a spy novel, and there's so many other things I want to go deeper into, like the David Sterling and the SAS and all that stuff, that involvement in here. But do you have plans for other books in the future? Are you working on
I do,
anything?
yeah. I'm bouncing a couple of ideas right now. I mean, it's been a while since that one came out, and I've sort of, you've been there. You've written five books so far, right. I think.
Yeah, fifth one comes out here in May.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
Thank you.
But you kind of know the horror of that process and locking yourself away and kind of writing it out. And it took a lot of research to go into that particular book. And I've been sort of hunting for. I don't think I really necessarily have the talent for fiction, but in terms of nonfiction and research and so on, I've been looking for the right story to tell. And I've got a couple of ideas that I'm bouncing around now. So I think I'm sort of ready for the second one, which hopefully will get going soon.
Well, I hope so, because I've been following, and I'm like, when's he going to announce that his next book is coming out? Because I want more, and anybody that reads this, everybody should read this, Killing for Profit. It's fascinating, but is going to want to read more of what you have to offer. And I want to read one part here, because there's a couple parts I want to read, but this is kind of the impetus for starting this book. And you say, quite by chance, I came across the story of a South African, a farm attack and rifles being smuggled across the border into Zimbabwe to be used to kill rhinos for their horns. I was intrigued. I wanted to know more. And so I dug. And the more I dug, the more I unearthed, and the more horrific I became. Horrified at the tales of ruthless criminal enterprises on a scale that I could not have imagined. What follows is the true story of poachers, killers, pimps, soldiers, generals, assassins, mercenaries, conmen, prostitutes, gun runners, game farmers, corrupt politicians, diplomats, and scoundrels. It is also the story of one of South Africa's most precious assets, an animal that has been around for 50 million years. This is the rhino's last stand, one that tragically they may not survive. I mean, it's great writing. And that just, that's who's not going to want to turn that page. So
and right you do there, the audiobook.
I don't know. I can give you Ray Porter's number. He's fantastic. He does mine. But that was the impetus to start going down this path and write a book. Like, when did you decide this was not going to be an article or a series of articles, but it was going to be a book?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's the thing about, the rhino horn trade. It's the kind of thing people don't really associate poaching, rhino horns, that kind of thing with organized crime or these kinds of characters. So I started with that story, and it was this guy, Johan Roos, who was sort of a petty con man / game farmer / poacher. He'd been convicted many times since the 1980s for poaching. And, he was smuggling these weapons across the border into Zimbabwe and supplying them to a gang of zebra poachers. These guys were poaching zebras, selling the skins, not really a big deal. But then they morphed into this rhino poaching gang. And it was around the time, we can come to that later, but when this market was really opening up in Vietnam. And a couple of these rifles were intercepted, and one of them, the serial numbers hadn't been removed. So I managed to, through contacts in Zimbabwe, get hold of the serial number, run it on this side. And it turned out that rifle had been stolen in an attack on a farm, an elderly couple living on a farm in South Africa. Farm attacks are unfortunately a big problem here. You've got rural communities living in quite isolated areas without the necessary police support. And these guys were effectively his neighbors, and ultimately became even closer neighbors after the attack when they moved to town for better safety and moved basically into a house around the corner from him. But he'd orchestrated, it seemed, this attack and getting these rifles, and the rifles were then shipped out. So, that story in itself was quite fascinating, but then it moved on and the stories just kept getting wilder and wilder. You had a Thai Laotian syndicate who were recruiting strippers and sex workers to pose as hunters, so that they could exploit, loopholes in hunting legislation. You had North Korean spies. This is now after the book came out, who were moving horn through Mozambique into South Africa, taking it out in diplomatic pouches. You had these old historical stories, which you mentioned, David Sterling, the SAS. And, this quite wild sort of idea back then to kind of tackle rhino poaching syndicates in Africa. So there were these characters and these amazing stories, which and I knew very little about it when I first started looking at it. Rhino poaching was this kind of thing that was happening on the periphery. The numbers were going up, but back then it was 122 rhinos have been poached. So it wasn't what it became, where you suddenly started losing over 1,000 a year, and we're now sitting in the position where you've got 10,000 rhinos in South Africa, in Africa, that have been poached, more than 10,000, close to 11,000. And South Africa being the country with the largest rhino population in the world, now facing this massive onslaught. And over the last decade, the Kruger National Park was, which I'm not sure if you've been there, but it's the crown jewel of our national parks in South Africa, and it's the last the last standing ground for South Africa's rhino population, losing 70% of their rhinos in the course of a decade. So it became this really thing, and there's this life and death thing where you've got people who are prepared to kill and actually die for a couple of kilograms of rhino horn. And that's what I wanted to really understand, is what is driving people to go out there and, want to shoot a rhino, get that horn out of a national park, massive risks. The guys have been trampled to death, poachers have been trampled to death by elephants, taken by lions, all of those kinds of elements. So what are the drivers? What's motivating all of this?
Yep. And I want to ask you a little bit more about what rhino horn is here in one second here. And I'm going to read this to give people a little bit of background. Perhaps the greatest irony is that rhinos are being killed for the very things that evolved to offer them a means of defense. On the black markets of Southeast Asia, rhino horn is worth more per kilogram than gold, cocaine, platinum, or heroin. It is a product that people are prepared to kill and die for. In Vietnam, it has become a party drug for the wealthy and a panacea for the very sick. And yet it offers no real scientific benefits. Its value is artificial, founded on myth, and propagated by greed. Man. So what is is rhino horn what your fingernail is made out of? And how did it become so valuable? These myths that have just grown, I guess, over the years. How did it become so valuable? What is it? And then I have a slew of questions about how this cycle works and how that guy ends up in the field with a rifle, killing that rhino, and what that trail looks like all the way back to Asia. But what is rhino and why is it so rhino horn and why is it so valuable?
So rhino horn has been traded for thousands of years. In China, it's been used for thousands of years. It was until fairly recently, and there's some dispute about how that's been changed, but it was until fairly recently in the sort of Chinese materia medica, the traditional medicine texts that underpin traditional Chinese medicine. And by extension, because China had conquered Vietnam and had moved into Vietnam, it became the basis for traditional Vietnamese medicine. So for thousands of years, people have been using rhino horn for a range of things, including chasing out demons, the more extreme versions, but also primarily as a fever reducer. If you have a fever, if you have some sort of disease that causes a fever, using that supposedly will help bring those symptoms down. the problem is that the markets keep evolving. So if you look at the markets in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and this was when rhino poaching was really hitting East Africa primarily, and then parts of Southern Africa. South Africa, because it was quite isolated, because of the apartheid regime, it was pretty much cut off. There were wars raging in Angola and Mozambique. Zimbabwe also similarly, you had conflict there. So South Africa's populations pretty much escaped that onslaught. But countries like, Kenya were being hit really hard. Zimbabwe got hit really hard in the 1980s and through into the early 1990s. And you had markets like Taiwan, for instance, which, a lot of rhino horn going out there, Singapore, Hong Kong. South Africa itself had built up quite close ties with some of those countries. It was as a result of sanctions busting. South Africa was under massive sanctions in the 1980s, but also in terms of trying to fund their own activities. So, through Angola, you had, and it's a story I tell in the book, where the South African military were basically smuggling ivory out of Angola into South Africa, selling it on to, back then, licensed dealers who were then trading it in Asia. So you had all these kinds of routes going on, and this massive onslaught. I mean, the black rhino population, which at one stage was, in the hundreds of thousands, reduced to, almost in the space of 2 decades to almost nothing. A handful, 4,000 or 5,000. And the black rhinos today remain the most endangered of all African rhinos. So those markets kept evolving, and no one really knows why. It's one of the key mysteries, and one of the key unsolved mysteries. Why did Taiwan suddenly become an area of demand for rhino horn? Or why did Yemen in the late 70s, with the oil boom, and that's potentially a hint, become a demand for rhino horn, which would be used in jambia daggers, these traditional daggers that many guys in Yemen wear? Why would then, moving on to more recent times, why would Vietnam suddenly emerge? And the only sort of thing that seems to link them together is these pockets of newfound wealth. As those countries develop, as their economies develop, Yemen, massive oil boom, end of the 70s, lots of money around. Basically all the rhino horn shifted to Yemen from Asia. I mean, there were some shipments going out. Vietnam, the same thing, one of the rising dragons of Asia. And that newfound wealth and the nouveau riche there, you'd find that sort of building up. That was where the demand was. Similarly, you had these urban myths that would do the rounds. So there was a tabloid newspaper in Hanoi which told the story about a Vietnamese Communist Party official. That story over the years and the telling, has changed. Sometimes it's a Vietnamese army general, sometimes it's some, prime minister or former prime minister who developed cancer, who was then cured of cancer by taking a mixture of rhino horn and rice wine. To put that in context, so Vietnam has very few hospitals with oncology wards. All of them basically are in major cities. So Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City tend to have most of those. So a lot of people coming from rural areas are arriving at hospitals, and these are not the greatest. I mean, I went to the oncology ward in Hanoi. You got people 2 to a bed, people sleeping under beds, hundreds of people queuing outside trying to get chemotherapy treatment, people who are arriving, in stage 4, cancer. And the story started doing the rounds. And then you'd have doctors there who would say, look, we'll treat you with chemotherapy and so on, but you should try this too, because maybe it'll help. Traditional medicine wards at these hospitals saying that kind of thing. So people latched onto that. And a lot of these guys were poor people who were pretty desperate, who would just spend everything that they had to get their hands on a piece of rhino horn. And sadly, in many cases, they were given buffalo horn. They were given anything but rhino horn. They were basically just scammed. So, and then that evolved over time to where, constantly you've got these networks looking for new markets. It's like the drugs trade, but it's like any commercial business. You're looking for opportunities. You're looking for, what's the next big thing? How are we going to sell more of the product? So rhino horn then morphed into a party drug where, kids were drinking it as a hangover cure in nightclubs. It became a status symbol for the very rich. So there's a banker, guy who was vice chairman of Sacom Bank, which is one of the second largest bank in Vietnam. He had an entire stuffed rhino from South Africa in his house, which he bought from a guy who shot it in one of these so-called pseudo hunts that we talk about, where you'd have hunters going out, applying for hunting permits, getting a permit to shoot a rhino. South Africa allows limited hunting of white rhino. There's a quota of hunts for black rhino, and that's meant to benefit conservation. So five black rhino a year. This guy had come out, got a hunting permit, shot the rhino, had a taxidermist stuff it, took the whole rhino back to Vietnam, and then given it to this banker as a housewarming gift. And with a little card saying, "Here's to your happy new home. Hope this brings you good luck." So the guy had this rhino in his living room. And first of all, that gift was completely illegal. So, ultimately, if you take a rhino trophy out, it's your personal trophy. You can't gift it, you can't sell it, you can't cut it up, you can't do anything. It's yours to hang on your wall. It's yours as a trophy hunter. The banker reported to police, phoned police, said, "No, someone broke into my house and they've made off with the rhino horns." And so you had this extraordinary image of this gray, quite not the best taxidermy I've seen rhino, with these horns kind of hacked off. Someone made off for them, and the cops there are looking into that. But no one's actually asked the question of how did this banker actually get the rhino, and what was the motivation of the guy giving it to, and what happened to the guy who actually did that. So those kinds of bizarre things. So you'd see rhino horn becoming this status symbol. Guys putting rhino horn on a mantelpiece or as part of a shrine. People giving chunks of rhino horn as gifts. And then that again morphed into rhino horn as an aphrodisiac being sold. So rhino horn wine, which was a newspaper myth. It was a 1950s, if I remember correctly, sort of newspaper myth that was created that people were using rhino horn as an aphrodisiac, and a Western sort of newspaper myth. But the syndicates made that real, so they started selling this, this aphrodisiac rice wine. And then you've got carvings, bangles, bracelets, beads, and that going to Chinese buyers who would come into Vietnam, go to places like Ny Ke, which is a village just outside Hanoi, where there are a lot of artisans and carvers, and which has been a hub of traffic and trade in rhino horn, which the Wildlife Justice Commission did an incredible investigation into. So you've got these constantly shifting markets, and you've got the guys on the supply side here in Africa who are trying to counter this, and then you've got this market in Asia which is expanding, changing. Syndicates that are operating quickly across borders. Law enforcement just simply can't keep up in many cases.
And you talk about it, the history that you talk about in here is fascinating as well. And when you talk about the Rhodesian Bush War in the 70s, actually protecting the rhinos for a little bit, because I guess focus was elsewhere, and how all that works. So that's fascinating. But the process of today, I guess, because things have morphed over time, just like any business, warfare, whatever, anything else is constant adaptation. So today, or in the last, let's say 20 years, that person or that group of people that end up getting onto a concession or into a national park with an AK-47 or with any rifle and taking one of these rhinos and sawing off the horn or chainsawing off, however they're doing it. Like, how much is that person making versus how much everybody along the way? Because then you have this whole illicit, essentially an economy where you have corrupt officials at different levels, local, national, international. So what does that look like with from that person getting hired to do that? How much are they making? And then where does that horn go from there? And who's getting paid off along the way? And how is it getting shipped out today or over the last decade or so? What does that look like?
Yeah. So, in terms of the weaponry, that's kind of an interesting one, because poaching in Southern Africa in some ways looks a lot different to poaching in East and Central Africa, where you have a lot of armed militias in Central and East Africa, particularly Central Africa, going in with, AKs. They're heavily armed. They're involved in insurgencies in some case. To Southern Africa, where your poachers have traditionally been using, I mean, there are cases where AK-47s have been used more as protection weapons than anything else. But these are guys going in with hunting rifles. Initially, quite like old antiquated stuff, old 303s and, kind of sort of rusting away. And then, over time becoming more and more sophisticated. So CZ550s, which were very popular here, a Czech rifle, very popular here as a hunting rifle, started turning up in Kruger National Park, for instance. And then you had sound suppressors, increasingly sophisticated sound suppressors. Back from, the days when guys would hand tool these really crude sound suppressors and sort of strap them onto the end of a barrel or, put rifling on themselves. And there was kind of, the guys that would seize those weapons would look at this going, I'm not sure I want to, take a shot with that. I mean, it could go badly wrong. Yeah. So on the ground, you've got, these poaching gangs which operate. So in the early days, a lot of the poaching, and I'm talking now specifically about South Africa, was coming across the Mozambican border into the Kruger National Park. The Kruger National Park is a national park the size of Israel, size of Wales. So it's pretty huge. It's a country. People who work there actually refer to it as the Republic of Kruger. It's kind of a country of its own in ways. And it borders Mozambique on the one side, and then you have South Africa on the other side. So on one side, on the South African side, you have a population living outside the park of around 1 million people. And actually, it's probably those numbers have grown since then. But it's a very high density population. There's a lot of people there. There's a lot of poverty. On the other side, you have quite dispersed villages in northern Mozambique, which run along that boundary with the Kruger National Park. And then you have the Limpopo National Park, which is on the Kruger side, on the Mozambique side, which is joined to Kruger. Essentially, they've dropped fences between the two. It's part of a project called the Peace Parks project, which is meant to drop fences, bring countries together around conservation. And there are people living within that park. And many of the poachers in those early days were coming from some of those villages in Mozambique. Small groups, normally 2 to 3 people. They'd walk into the Kruger. Back then, you had rhinos, which were largely scattered all over the park. You had quite a lot of rhinos in the north, quite a lot in those boundary areas. They were very easy to find. The population was much bigger than it is today. So you have a guy with a rifle. You maybe have another guy who'd be doing protection. Sometimes with an AK, sometimes just with a 9mm or something like that. Someone who'd be a tracker and someone who'd carry water and supplies. And these guys weren't that sophisticated. You'd see crazy scenes of people with bright pink backpacks going into the national park, which just seems somewhat self-defeating. Running shoes, like these old sneakers that had like seen better days. They'd find a rhino. In some cases, you had guys who'd never, seen a rhino before, never shot a rhino. So the whole thing was kind of make it up as you go. They'd make a kill, and then as they grew more and more sophisticated, they learned things like, anti-tracking. Some of these guys were quite experienced trackers themselves. These are, young guys who grew up looking after their father's cattle. So they have some innate tracking ability particularly from those rural communities. They learned, for instance, that you didn't need an axe or a machete to hack the horn off, that if you took a knife and cut around the base plate of a rhino horn, pretty much like your fingernail, you could lever it off and just pop the horn off almost.
Oh, wow.
Which makes it a lot easier than poaching elephants. Now, elephants, it's a lot of work and it's a lot of hard work to get those tusks out, and they weigh a lot. So it's, you've then got to lug them through the bush. Whereas rhino horn, it's a couple of pounds, couple of kilograms. Carry that off with you. The horn would then be taken out of the park. And some of these groups, they move at speed. And you talk to rangers on the ground who are trying to track them or intercept them. They move at a pace through that bush because they're experienced. And I'm not talking about your more sophisticated gangs, and they can move large distances very, very quickly, and they don't slow down. Get across the border back into Mozambique, then you would, go to the boss that you have rented the hunting rifle from. In most cases, they rent the rifles, so they'd have to pay a fee for that. They rent the bullets too, and they pay a fee for the bullets. And the bullets that they don't use, they have to return. And the boss would then move that through his chain. You've got guys who run taxi businesses, so some of them are smugglers. You've got middlemen, intermediaries. And then ultimately from there, your horn is moving to Maputo, the capital of Mozambique, and to invariably either Vietnamese or Chinese middlemen, or occasionally the odd North Korean spy who's really sort of inventive. And they would then get it out through there. And they'd use, I think that's where the trail gets a bit murky for those of us that look into this. There's enough evidence to suggest that they're using the same kinds of smuggling routes that are being used for other commodities. So, the same smuggling routes is being used for heroin or other drugs, or for rubies going out, or smuggled gold, timber, right. And bribing the same officials and the same customs guys to get it through airports. Rhino horn is great to take through an airport. And again, back in the early days, guys would take horns, shove it in a suitcase, smear toothpaste all over the horn or shampoo, put it in a plastic bag. You didn't really have detector dogs that were trained to pick up on rhino horn back then.
Wow.
So they'd hide the smell, because rhino horns, after a period of time, I'm sure but once they've been hacked off, it takes a while for them to dry out, and the smell of the rod is pretty overpowering. Yeah. So you've got to kind of cover it. And then carry it on as hand luggage, wow. Which you can't do again with ivory. Ivory, you need containers. You need a much bigger operation for ultimately a lot less return on your investment. Rhino horn has significantly high value. So at the poaching level, it varies. We did a project at Traffic, the International Wildlife Trade Monitoring Network, where I worked previously, where we interviewed poachers in jail. And some of those guys were getting anything from a couple of $100 up to $2,000-$3,000. Your really big shooters, your good shooters, the guys who knew what they were doing, who were experienced, been doing it for a long time, could pretty much command a much higher price. Oh, wow. And then as it goes up the chain, it picks up value. Those early prices from, there were figures back in 2010, 2011 of like $60,000 a kilo on the black market. Those figures have come down quite dramatically. And I think, back then, and it probably wasn't really known when I was writing the book, but there were syndicates who were testing the market to see what the market was willing to pay. And I think, initially you had people willing to pay prices like that, and over time it's come down. These days it's less than a third of that in those markets. Yeah.
Interesting. So that's good for the rhino then, I would guess. Is that has that shown any difference in the demand for, or?
Yeah, it's tricky to say. Look, the demand seems to still be there.
Okay.
The demand hasn't really changed.
So then it's not good. The prices so then I guess it would not be good, because then it would be cheaper to get that same impact in Asia.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Gosh.
So the price is still, the price is still pretty high. It's still there. But COVID, lockdowns, all of that has had its own impact. And at the moment it's really tricky to understand what's happening with the rhino horn market, because there haven't been that many flows going out of Africa. With passenger planes basically grounded, no one's carrying rhino horn out.
Okay.
There have been seizures of containers trying to ship rhino horn out. So there have been a couple of those seizures taking place. So no one really knows what is happening at the moment. And that's the big mystery. Are guys stockpiling horn in Africa, waiting for the gateway to open again and then shipping it out? And similarly in Vietnam, there's some movement going on, but not quite on the same scale.
Jeez, amazing. And I want to read this too, because it's so, the writing is wonderful, as well as what you're saying here. That night, a rust red poacher's moon rises into the darkness, the largest full moon of the year. As it ascends, the color bleeds away until only a slivery glow remains. Pale light filters through the bushes and the thorn trees. Out there, somewhere in the shadows, silent groups of poachers are heading south, and across the border in the Kruger, the game rangers, soldiers, and cops are lying in wait. 4 days later, the stinking remains of 2 rhino carcasses are found near the park's Crocodile Bridge gate. The horns have been hacked off. The rangers pick up the trail. Broken blades of grass, scuff marks in the sand, flattened scrub, crushed plants. Police and soldiers are deployed. Hours later, there's a crackle of gunfire and a man lies dead. 2 others are taken away, their hands cable tied behind their backs. 4 horns, a hunting rifle, and an axe are found. The number of rhinos killed in the Kruger now stands at 130, and another corpse is consigned to a cheap pine coffin in a dusty grave. That's great writing. You need to write another book. That's fascinating.
Thank you.
So
I remember that vividly, actually, because I was kind of in Mozambique, and I remember watching. I actually took pictures of that moon. It was incredible. And we were. I was at that stage trying to sort of interview some poachers in Mozambique. So I was sitting in the Limpopo National Park in one of their spots there. That sat there that night, outside a fire going, watching that moon going up, and knowing that something was going to happen that night. Something was going to happen around that time period. Yeah.
The different levels of corruption when we're talking about this much money, just like with drugs anywhere really in the world, but particularly in the United States and into Europe, there's so much money involved that people are willing to go to extraordinary lengths, obviously, to move a product for which there is insatiable demand in the same country that's trying to stifle this this incursion of drugs. But at all these different levels, when you see this corruption and you see, I don't know, is it payoffs or how does that work? Are you seeing game wardens in some cases that are part of these syndicates and that are supposed to be obviously running troops against it? And same thing at higher levels in local governments and national governments. What does that look like? That scale of corruption? And in some cases, is it bribes? Is it looking out of the way? Is it blackmail? Is it actual payoffs, or just someone turning their head because they're scared of their family being killed? Like, what are we looking at when we're talking about corruption and coercion at those other levels? Not the people that are out there hacking the horns off and actually doing the shooting, but those that allow that rhino horn to move by either taking a bribe or looking the other way.
Yeah. So I think it's all of the above. To tell you a bit of a personal story, if you look at the book, there's a bunch of photographs in the middle, and I think on one of the early photos there's a picture of 2 rangers in Zimbabwe doing anti-tracking. There's a guy there called Sylvester. Yeah, at the bottom there. Sylvester was one of the best rangers, one of the most fearless rangers in Zimbabwe, in that part of Zimbabwe at the time. He'd been through multiple firefights. He'd been in contact with poachers with AK-47s in that case, presumably ex-military, with a bolt-action rifle, and he'd taken them on single-handedly. He was known to be almost foolhardy in his bravery. Like charging these guys with a bolt-action rifle and just firing shot after shot after shot. So he'd been through these. He'd saved some of his colleagues. He'd nearly been killed a couple of times. And the tragedy about Sylvester is that Sylvester became, he ran into debt. He developed a bit of a gambling problem, I understand. And he ultimately became, he was fired from his job. And this was a guy who's been groomed for great things. And he's now in prison in South Africa awaiting trial. He became involved in rhino poaching here. He became involved in rhino poaching in Zimbabwe, to the point where his ex-colleagues in the anti-poaching force knew that he was out there and guiding poachers into the area. And they probably would have. I wouldn't be surprised if they would have killed him if they came across him, because I mean he was playing a pivotal role in threatening their lives. So that for me is the kind of thing that you see. That's where corruption really eats away. There was another guy as well in the Kruger National Park, again being groomed for really a high position there. Ran into financial difficulties. There's almost a thread here. This was a guy who won awards for his conservation work. Who was widely respected, who was acclaimed at least within South Africa, who ultimately turned out to be corrupt and was arrested with a rhino horn, with a corrupt traffic officer who was with him. So I think it's very easy. I think we tend to treat corruption as something that's sort of over there. But I think in this space, it becomes, and this is true of any illicit economy, is it's very easy for people to slip into that. If you're facing these threats on a daily basis, and your own life is kind of a mess, and you don't have the cash, and you've got a wife and kids and all that sort of stuff, the temptation is great. And these syndicates go out and they actively try and find weaknesses. They try and find, particularly in places, again, like the Kruger or the Bibi Valley Conservancy or Etosha National Park in Namibia, they target rangers, they get inside info, they've got sources on the ground. They try and build up a profile of rangers that they think they can corrupt, or police officers they can corrupt, and they go after them. And they pick away at those weaknesses. So they become very slick at doing that. I think what's encouraging though in some ways is that your core, so in the Kruger National Park's got a sort of rapid response unit, a core ranger force to deal with poaching. There have been very few, if any, incidents that I'm aware of where there's been corruption there. So it's sometimes in the broader field ranger corps where you have issues. But it can happen anywhere, and there's constantly sort of questions, and it's people being smeared to and being accused of corruption when they're not necessarily corrupt, which is something else that happens quite a lot in South Africa. Unfortunately, we've had cases where people who are actually investigating corruption then are accused of corruption themselves. So it gets very messy very quickly. And I think it's very difficult. They've tried to put in procedures to do stress voice analysis testing on staff to try and get a sense of what's going on there. They've tried to do lifestyle investigations, but they run into a wall too with some of the trade unions. And the trade unions are not particularly don't particularly care for that kind of scrutiny, and are championing their members' privacy and so on and so forth. So politically, it becomes a very complicated issue. Beyond the national parks, you're looking at government officials, particularly at local government level. Guys working in the pseudo hunting that I write about in that book, these sham hunts, which were an abuse of hunting regulations and legislation. Designed purely to get rhino horn legally to Asia. That involved officials turning blind eyes, officials signing off hunting registers, knowing full well that the 4'9" young Vietnamese woman who could barely hold a hunting rifle and was standing there next to the carcass, dressed completely inappropriately in sort of bright pink outfit, had never been a hunter in her life. Mm-hmm. That kind of thing. So you have that, and then there have been suggestions of corruption involving more senior officials. Most of those unconfirmed. So it's a constant challenge. I mean, corruption is ultimately probably the biggest challenge that we face. I mean, it's eroded our police force. It's eroded our intelligence networks. It's eroded our military. There's stories too about the military deployment in the Kruger. Admittedly, they're also, again, good side. I don't want to say everyone's corrupt, because there really are good guys out there. The Kruger anti-poaching, for instance, their operations would not have been possible without a detachment of Air Force guys who were basically running comms for them on the ground, particularly with night operations, who were, guiding those flights in, late at night. We're doing all that sort of stuff. Some of the reconnaissance soldiers who were deployed in Kruger at various stages, remarkable work kind of tracking down poaching groups. So they're really good people who are being undercut by what these other guys are doing.
Yeah, but as with most illicit networks, these the socioeconomic conditions play a huge role in these. And so it's oftentimes a lot more gray than black and white than we look at here over a latte at a Starbucks here in the United States, thinking, oh, rhino, it's wanted in Asia, black, white, connect the dot, that's it. Like there's a lot of other forces at play here, which is why it's such a difficult issue to deal with. And then there's so many fascinating chapters in here, but the apartheid secret chapter. What was going on with that? And I have, let's see. I mean, there's so many fascinating things to read here, but right here, and this is a little bit farther back. This is January of 1979. We say a 23-year-old intelligence officer returns to a base in Namibia after an operation deep inside Angola. Des Berman is strung out and exhausted, a lieutenant in the South African Defense Force. He's been working closely with elements of UNITA, UNITA, is that how you say it?
UNITA.
Movement as a military advisor. He's lost count of the number of contacts he's been in lately, firefights, things that move fast on the ground. Berman and his team are perpetually on the run, pursued and shot at by Cuban gunships. By now, the ops follow a familiar pattern. Get in, find the enemy, kill them, and get out in a cloud of dust and a whirl of rotor blades. The frequent deployments take their toll. Berman needs a new rifle. If you're regularly dropped into combat by chopper, the solid stock of the standard issue R1 is nothing but a hindrance. He's looking for a rifle with a folding stock. He dumps his pack and heads to the stores. The warehouse is full of Green Army packing cases. He opens one, then another, and another. He's astonished by what he finds. Every single case was packed with ivory and rhino horn and game skins, including sable, roan antelope, leopard skins, and lion skins. Man, there's so many amazing chapters in. But how did you find that out? Find that story? Must have talked to maybe. Did you talk to him, or how did you get that story? And then can you talk a little bit more about that chapter?
Yeah. So I mean, that for me was really interesting. It was kind of one of these forgotten stories in South Africa's history, where there'd been a lot of reporting in the 1980s around, movements of ivory, movements of other wildlife products out of Angola being smuggled out by the military. These were, in most cases, this was ivory which UNITA, led by Jonas Savimbi at the time, which South Africa was allied to. I'm not going to go into all the details of the conflict, but ultimately it was a proxy war during one of the Cold War proxy wars. You had Cuban deployments on the other side. You had Savimbi and the South Africans. And Savimbi's guys were shooting a lot of elephants. The South Africans themselves, in some cases, were shooting a lot of elephants, and those shipments of ivory were being moved out of Angola back into South Africa and then shipped off to places like Taiwan and so on. And then the money from that would, in some either disappear or go to funding the war effort. And so there was a general, actually, a guy called Jan Breitenbach, who's a legendary special forces general in South Africa. He was one of those guys who he really led from the front line. He was out there with these guys on the ground. I don't think I've ever met anyone who served under him who doesn't have total and utmost respect for him, and would probably follow him into combat today, if he decided to do that. Although he's obviously very elderly now. His brother, ironically, was a very famous novelist and writer who'd signed up with the ANC. So you had those kinds of characters who were involved there, but Breitenbach was the man who sort of blew the whistle on what was happening in these ivory shipments. So aside from being a military general, he was also an avid conservationist. And, the military bases that he ran, they had, there was wildlife around there. They had, in one case, there was a pet lion that used to roam around the one base. Quite crazy stuff, but he was passionate about the environment. He wrote a beautiful book about his experiences there later. But he blew the whistle on it, and there were others like Des Berman, who ultimately testified before a commission of inquiry in South Africa, which, unusually for a commission of inquiry in the apartheid days, actually exposed these kinds of things. A lot of that stuff would have been brushed under the carpet. And the Kumlieben Commission of Inquiry. So I started scratching around. I'd read some stuff. Judge Kumlieben, who led the commission, is retired. So I got hold of him. I was struggling to get a copy of the commission report. He actually sent me his own copy, which was incredible. This reporter just phoning out of nowhere. And then started cold calling people, trying to find people who are involved. And Berman, I managed to find a number for him. He's running another business now, and he was surprisingly initially a bit hesitant and wary, but then surprisingly keen to talk more about it. And I found a lot of those guys that were around then were, they may not want to talk about the war or the conflict. There's a lot of vets don't particularly like talking about the conflicts they're involved in, but this was one issue that really got them heated up. This scale of the slaughter that they saw. So it was piecing those bits together, and there were these other fascinating elements. I mean, there's a chapter in the book about a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service operation at the time, which touched on South Africa smuggling ivory and South African army guys smuggling ivory into the United States, and this undercover operation, which this guy Rich Moulton, who still lives in Hartford, Connecticut. I actually met him about a year or two after the book came out. I sort of interviewed him online and then went to the States and met him there. We had coffee at a diner. It was great. And I mean, he's a guy with incredible stories too. He was involved in all kinds of investigations in Afghanistan and places like that. Back in the 1980s. In that case, it was involved a leopard skin, I think it was. So yeah, it was also a very strange story. But all those elements, came together. And for me, that history was, it's something that's kind of been forgotten about. People don't know about it. And it very much tells a story of conservation in South Africa and efforts that have gone on. Some efforts that have worked really well, some efforts less so, to combat rhino poaching. You mentioned Sir David Stirling, the founder of the British SAS, and this quite crazy operation. If you think about it, it's the kind of stuff that if you're writing about a novel, it probably would sound a little bit too far-fetched.
Yeah, it sounds like fiction.
Exactly. I mean, and weirder than fiction in some way. I mean, these guys getting together.
That's how you know it's true.
Exactly. And coming together to do this undercover operation, ex-British SAS guys, bring them into South Africa, infiltrate some of these networks, try and clamp down on them. And then I think eventually and I think the intentions were really good. But I think ultimately it started getting a little bit beyond itself. There was a bit of mission creep. You had people then coming up with options of, maybe we should start assassinating dealers, which, I think some people would probably look at it and go, that's not a bad idea. but it's the operation sort of lost steam and it grew beyond itself. And I think there were personal elements that came into play there too. But the basis of it is an intelligence gathering operation, and if you talk to people who were there, like John Hanks, who was one of South African conservationists, who was very involved in that operation. There's actually subsequently written a book about it called Operation Lock. He would argue that the intelligence gathering that they did was on a different level to some of the intelligence gathering that was being done at the time, and that there were good elements there. That you had these guys in the field who were doing surveillance. They were pulling up together information, and that information potentially could have had value, but it never quite got to that point.
Interesting. Yeah, I was going to ask you about Operation Lock. I'm glad to hear there's another book about it because I wanted to know. That's the name of one of your chapters here, and I wanted to know more about it. And it's so fascinating. And I'm gonna read this part because it's so good. But there's the World Wildlife Federation, something called the 1001 Club, Cass Enterprises, which is the David Stirling SAS tie-in, and
these
amazing.
These rich guys in the Netherlands, the royal family.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
It's
you
crazy.
can't make this stuff.
I know that whole chapter could be, I could just use that and kind of spread it out into a whole 100,000 word novel. And people would think it was fiction. But it's great. You say the file was meant to have been destroyed 22 years ago, but the old man kept it, hoarding it among a stack of documents in a locked filing cabinet. I felt at the time it was important, he explains. The creased manila folder is marked in red, private and confidential, and stamped Investigations, subject, Operation Lock. There's a note penciled on the cover, Illegal Rhino Horn Smuggling. He opens the file, crooked fingers grasping at the yellowed pages. You didn't get this from me, he says softly, as if the ghosts of a forgotten scandal might hear us. He leaves through it. Secret, no unauthorized dissemination. Warning, compromise of contents or part thereof of this document could lead to the death of personnel involved in the operation. The folder contained details of a disastrous covert operation aimed at targeting and killing rhino and ivory poaching kingpins in the late 1980s. The ensuing scandal reached to the highest echelons of the worldwide fund for nature, the Dutch royal family, and a British mercenary firm staffed by some of the most decorated veterans of Britain's Special Air Service. It is the story of gamekeepers turned poachers and men who may well have become the willing pawns of apartheid spies. It's awesome. Once again, that whole thing right there, I could take those couple paragraphs and just turn it into a novel. It's fascinating. And I'm not going to use a lot of this because I like doing little touch points that make people go, I wonder if that's real or not. I'm interested in that, and then go down the path of researching it themselves. But there's so many things in here that sound like fiction, as we discussed. What was the most surprising part, either of writing the book, or that you found out in researching the book, or have discovered since? Because I would think that when you write a book like this, and then it becomes more widely disseminated, people see it and then want to talk to you about it and say, hey, you know what, this and this and this, and you learn even more in the decade since. But what's been the most surprising thing that you either learned from writing this book, from that research, or in the years since?
For me, it's still ultimately, I think it comes down to the lengths that people will go to get their hands on rhino horn. That I just find, you talk about these crazy characters and all that sort of stuff, but subsequent to the book, I did another investigation which looked at the role of North Korea in wildlife trafficking, North Korean operatives. And I eventually went to South Korea, met a couple of North Korean defectors there who'd been involved in embassy operations in Africa, smuggling horn out for sale in China, as a way to raise funds for the regime of Kim Jong-un. Again, it's the kind of thing that just seems so incredibly bizarre. Why would people go to those lengths? The one story that came out there were these two guys that drove up to Mozambique from South Africa in a North Korean embassy car, diplomatic plates. They get waved through the border. They go into Mozambique. They then got arrested, and it's kind of murky about why they got arrested, but they got stopped by Mozambican police, or possibly Mozambican intelligence people, who searched the car, and they found rhino horns, and they found about, I think it was $100,000 in cash in the vehicle. And they were detained for a while. One guy was a taekwondo master who had been in South Africa for a long time, who'd been training in taekwondo here, North Korean guy. The other guy was a senior diplomat. But it seems that the taekwondo master was also, and this is, I discovered through doing research and talking to people on this particular case, it's one of the ways that North Korea implants spies into foreign countries, is through using taekwondo and that kind of thing. And this guy, there was a bit of a paper trail which suggests that he actually was a North Korean spy and had been a North Korean spy for quite some time, while teaching taekwondo classes. So that's again, it's why there are easier things to do than driving to Mozambique, hanging around in sort of dark parts of Maputo, the capital, trying to buy a rhino horn from some guy and then bring it across the border into South Africa. This is high risk stuff. Sure, maybe the reward's okay, but you could probably do better smuggling cigarettes or moving gold or buying, cars duty free as a diplomat and then shipping those out. So it's those kinds of lengths of things, and it still fascinates me. And every time you hear news stories about poaching, or new people who've been arrested, is those links, or the people who keep coming back. You look at even now, 10 years on from the height of pseudo hunting activity in South Africa, some of the people that are involved in the illicit trade in rhino horn, whose names keep coming up, are people who first emerged then. People, Vietnamese guys whose names appear on hunting registers, who went back to Vietnam but have developed and expanded and grown in the illegal wildlife trade. Some of them have become syndicate bosses in their own right, or now moved into other illicit activities. So those names keep coming back, and people keep taking that risk.
Huh.
So I think for me, that was probably the most surprising thing in a way, was just the lengths that people would go to for, it's a piece of dead horn, basically.
Interesting. What? It's the North Korean Taekwondo master spy. It sounds like the plot of a really bad 1980s action film, or maybe a fantastic 1980s action film. I don't know. I really love it. I can see it in my mind's eye right now. Amazing. And Interpol has a wildlife crime working group that has access to DNA samples. And when I was in South Africa last, we actually did that. We tranquilized a rhino. We took measurements of the horn. They implanted some sort of a tracking. Anyway, they did some stuff there and took DNA samples as well. But how's that Interpol? What is that Interpol group? And it's a worldwide task force of Interpol.
So if you're looking at Interpol, a lot of people see Interpol as, the sort of global police agency, but Interpol if you really want to be kind of break it down quite crudely, is Interpol works like a post office, works like the US Postal Service. So it brings together, it's a communication channel for law enforcement agencies to communicate. So, put out red notices through that. They can coordinate investigations, so they can coordinate investigations with multiple countries, hopefully. But Interpol is only, in many ways, only as good as the countries or the country officers that make it up. So, every country has its local NCB, its National Criminal Bureau, where police from that country are assigned to the NCB. The NCB is nominally, is a representative of Interpol, but that country will appoint people to that position. The working group, the environmental working group, though, has been really, really useful in trying to coordinate law enforcement responses and bring law enforcement expertise around the table, together with people, working to some degree on conservation, but mainly law enforcement expertise. One of the challenges in tackling something like rhino poaching is, and you talk to people who work on the law enforcement side, very often it's the wrong people sitting around the table. So you'll have a conference, an environmental conference happening, or you'll have a workshop happening, or you'll have a law enforcement strategy being drawn up by conservationists. And we've seen that time and time again. Department of Environmental Affairs in South Africa, or a game department, or some other sort of environmental department in another country. Because it's a conservation issue and it's seen as a conservation issue, they are tasked with coming up with a law enforcement strategy. The problem is cops don't really, they're not going to take orders from another government department. Cops are cops. And law enforcement strategy is a very different thing to police than it is to another department who has no idea what they're kind of drawing up. So I think where Interpol was really good there was trying to get the right people around the table, and having people working within environmental departments who work on enforcement issues together with law enforcement people, and discussing that issue and trying to come up with approaches and policy approaches and coordinate that. But that has been probably the biggest challenge, and I think it's going to be more of a challenge now in the age of COVID, where conservation departments, environmental departments are trying to act as police. They're trying to deal with what is ultimately a law enforcement problem. And that's my big fear at the moment with the with the impact that the pandemic has had, conservation areas, game parks, hunting reserves. There are no tourists coming in. There are no hunters coming in. There's no money coming in. Governments in Africa are facing massive economic fallout from the pandemic and from pandemic lockdowns. The first place that budgets are going to be cut are things like conservation, things like environmental departments, because there's so many other priorities. And in terms of policing priorities, there are even more priorities now, in that take precedence over environmental issues. So that's kind of quite a key nub. And how do you fix that? And how do you fill that gap?
Is that the where we're failing? I guess if you're looking at this problem, having looked at it for so long as you have and studied it so in depth, where are we failing? And is it, hey, that demand in Asia, no matter what, because of that demand, and until that gets turned off, we can play whack-a-mole over here in Africa all we want, just like kind of with drugs or with terrorism, whatever else. You're one and then another pops up, or you kill the wrong guy and then you get a better guy in his place, or whatever, because he learns how you got the last one. So where are we failing there, or what did you see that really needs to be fixed, or that can be done better when you look at that problem?
Yeah, I think that we need to look at it from multiple sort of levels. I think one of the prevailing challenges, and I'm not sure it's a challenge that's going to go away, so we need to find ways of working around it, is law enforcement agencies which are hindered by borders, by bureaucracy, by red tape, who can't adapt as quickly as the criminal networks can. You cut off one arm, you shut down one element of the syndicate, you stop a couple of couriers, they'll have some new guys in the next day. Right. They'll change the airport they use, or the border post they use. Law enforcement simply, by its very nature, can't adapt that quickly. Collaboration, information sharing, intelligence sharing is still a massive problem. I think it's got better, but it's not, and I'm not sure it's ever going to get much better than it is right now. I think there's greater cooperation in sharing financial intelligence. The banks are on board. The banks are working with police. I think that there are trust relationships that are built up between law enforcement and conservation people in South Africa, for instance, in Mozambique. I was quite relieved or pleased to see before, prior to the COVID lockdown, about a year before that and so on, you saw Chinese enforcement guys from their customs department proactively doing investigations with counterparts in Africa. We've seen investigations where the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration has collaborated with U.S. Fish and Wildlife, plus law enforcement agencies in African countries investigating syndicates that are doing both drugs and ivory poaching. So all of that is really encouraging, but we need a lot more of that. We need, those U.S. cases and some of the Chinese cases are great examples of how you can do cooperation across borders, across multiple legal jurisdictions, and actually get an enforcement action going, and not just targeting kingpins and going after kingpins, but targeted investigations going after the whole sort of management layer of a transnational network. You can take out the boss, you can take out the poacher at the bottom. There'll be another poacher, there'll be another boss. But if you systematically eradicate, let's use corporate stuff. But if you take out the accounts department and you take out the shipping department, they have a big problem. You basically take out that part there, they've got to rebuild those structures. So it's those kinds of targeted investigations. Demand reduction campaigns, which are really, really slow. And we've been working on demand reduction campaigns in Asia for years, in China, and public, publicity campaigns. Some of them do seem to be showing benefits. I think the ones that are targeted at younger people tend to be more effective. Get the kids to shame the adults, that kind of strategy. But I think that ultimately what it comes down to is you need those countries to enforce those laws. Rhino horn trade is illegal in Vietnam. It's illegal in China. It's illegal in Laos. you need that will on that side to do investigations. I mean, I was encouraged the other day to see there was a case in Hanoi where a rhino horn trafficker who was arrested with about 50 pieces of rhino horn got a 14-year jail sentence. That's unheard of in Vietnam. The Vietnam people walk away with fines, or people walk away with no sentences. Or cases just disappear. So that is a really interesting to see, and it'd be interesting to monitor and see why that particular case led to a sentence like that. And is this some kind of change? You mentioned DNA, sharing of DNA. South Africa has this amazing DNA database, and you've been there. I mean, they dehorn the rhino, they chip the rhino, so you can pick up the horn. I mean, invariably the chip is removed by syndicates when they just drill it out. But the DNA is recorded, and that's vital information, because if you get that rhino horn seized in wherever, in China, in Beijing, and another African country, Mozambique, you've got evidence of the crime. And you can prove that horn was smuggled, and you can use it there've been some really good cases where that's been done. I think, we need to, also debate other alternatives. This is a particularly controversial one, and it's been probably the most divisive issue in conservation. But there's a very strong lobby here to push for legalized trade in rhino horn. Can you farm enough rhino horn to supply the markets? Rhino horn regrows. So, a lot of farmers dehorn their rhinos anyway to prevent poaching. And that horn is stockpiled. It's stored away. You've got, John Hume is the biggest single private rhino owner in the world. He's sitting on tons and tons of rhino horn, which was an investment. He's got more than 1,000 rhinos that he's bred. You've got huge stockpiles of rhino horn. But the difficulty with that is, how do you create a system that is, impervious to the kind of corruption levels that we see? How do you create a system where you can trade horn, and how much, do we know enough about the markets? Do we know, whether we can actually, fill those markets? Can we satiate those markets? So I think there are a lot of unanswered questions, but those are the sort of debates that are raging. So do we say what we've been doing for so long isn't working, and we try something completely radical? Do we, just reinvent the wheel in a way, or try and come up with other strategies, or do we simply try and do what we've been doing but do it better and do it in a more targeted way? So I think I wououldn't be sitting here if I had the solutions. I'd probably be sitting on a beach somewhere drinking a cocktail. But but it's kind of it's that sort of thing. I think it's something we're going to wrestle with for a very long time. The other element also is to get rhinos to breed. If rhinos are not breeding, you've got a problem. And the Kruger population, which is crucial, is kind of hit a point where poaching was outstripping breeding rates. Just the rhinos have a gestation period of 18 months. So it's a long time. And when they're stressed, they don't breed. So poaching pressure also has that impact on those populations. And then breaking those populations up. So we had a huge translocation the other day of, there's a private reserve in South Africa, Pinda Private Reserve. 30 rhinos moved from there to Rwanda to restart a rhino population in Rwanda. So that's a strategy that's worked really well in the past. If you look at the 1960s, when Dr. Ian Player, who's sort of the doyen of conservation in South Africa, brother of Gary Player, the golfer, Ian and a small team of guys, Tony Harthorn, who was a veterinarian, they single-handedly saved the white rhino population in South Africa from extinction. There were a handful left. What they did was they split the population up. They moved them to different reserves. They moved them overseas. They got them to breed. They also, hunting became an element of that. Ian Player always liked to make that statement that the biggest irony about saving rhinos was that it was through uncontrolled hunting in colonial times that they were basically brought to the brink of extinction. But it was through regulated hunting in the 20th century that they were brought back, and through game farmers investing in rhinos, allowing some hunts, then, putting money back into conservation, breeding more rhinos, buying more rhinos, rhino auctions. And that way you grew the population. And it became South Africa's greatest conservation success story, which is, sadly now in danger of being undone. But I think, splitting up those populations, finding new secure habitats. So all of these, these are just a couple of things off the top of my head, but there's no one single magical silver bullet.
Yeah. Having studied it for so long, what do you think about that legalization of rhino horn? Because it's a similar conversation that goes on about drugs or other, illicit substances and that sort of thing. What do you think about legalizing that horn, and guys like you become billionaires all in a day, I guess? But what his investment finally pays off. But having studied it for so long, what do you think about that, legalizing that horn and growing that horn and making it something that's not an illegal substance?
It's a tricky one, and I'm somewhat on the fence in the sense that I think we need to know a lot more. I do think that there's a need for us to relook at the strategies that we are employing. But I think there are also a lot of unknown quantities. And I think, for me, there are a couple of drawbacks. One is setting up the system, and some people, the Private Rhino Owners Association in South Africa, have come up with an idea which, would allow for regulated, controlled sales. So it's something worth exploring there. I think the other problem, though, is the mixed messaging side of things. And that's what a lot of people who quite vehemently opposed to that idea come up with, is rhino horn's illegal in Vietnam. It's illegal in China, at least on paper. People are using it and so on. We are telling them to clamp down. If we then go and say, well, actually, we want to sort of try, and I've had Vietnamese government officials ask me this question, where they've had dealings with officials from South Africa, and they're saying, well, what do you want? Do you want to trade the horn, or do you want us to enforce the regulations? And I think if you can come up with a system that works, there's a potential there to explore. But I think it's something that needs a lot more research, a lot more debate, and we need to try and work out whether there is a way of feasibly setting up things. I think also the world has changed a bit in the COVID era, with so much focus on China, the links between zoonotic diseases and pandemics. Is there a newfound willingness that one can capitalize on in China to potentially enforce trade? There's some signs that that's quite good, particularly when it comes to live wildlife trade, but not so much with trade in horns or lion bones or issues like that. Like so many things, it's complicated. There's these gray areas and debates that's raging. And I think that the difficulty for me also, is it's kind of the debate is so polarized. You can't actually get people around the table to talk rationally about these issues. People are either pro-trade, anti-trade, and never the twain shall meet. And I think that there's room for those kinds of discussions, to sit down and actually have considered discussion. What are we going to do? It's the same discussion people have when they say, great, let's ban hunting. As the UK has indicated that they're going to do, they're going to ban hunting trophies coming in. That's all well and good, but what are you going to put in place? What's going to replace that? And have you thought through the potential economic impacts and the potential conservation impacts? If you Botswana is a nice example where they banned hunting, and they were, unforeseen consequences rising in poaching, et cetera, et cetera.
Kenya too.
So it's great. Kenya exactly. So put that on the table. That's fine. But what are your alternative solutions going to be? You can't, deal with an issue in a vacuum. You've got to have something in place. So that's where it also gets quite tricky.
Yeah, it's interesting. No matter what the issue is, it seems that there is a benefit for organizations to keep things polarized because they can activate a base and generate more funds. Like our politicians can do it, our tech companies can do it, for advertising purposes and all that sort of a thing. And then now they can control behaviors. I mean, there's all sorts of these next 10 years when it comes to those sorts of things. And no matter what the issue is, if we can't sit down and sit around a table and have a coffee and have a beer together and try to work towards solutions in a rational way, especially when we're being torn apart by those entities who benefit from us staying divided, it's going to be very difficult to come up with solutions to anything or to move the ball forward anywhere. But it's interesting that you mentioned going across the middle. So we call it in the military cross-cut targeting, and probably I would guess very few military people even know about cross-cut targeting because you hear about the head of the snake, and it's a very cool thing to say. And we all grew up in these movies where you go after that leader, and so it's that the impact of popular culture on us as we grow older we don't even realize. But when you think it through, as you have done, and you think about, okay, you got that tactical guy on the ground with the rifle that's shooting the rhino. You have these people, this demand in Asia. But there's this whole group of middle people, and we call that cross-cut targeting. And if you go after that, it makes it very difficult for those two at the top and the bottom to meet and continue this cycle. So it's a fascinating thing. I talk about it. I mentioned it in one of my books, but when I brought it up to military people, even very senior people that should know, they more often than not don't. And the other thing you mentioned about the DEA, it was interesting after 9/11, we were so focused in the military on the tactical level side of things, but moving people became some of those same rat lines that would move drugs, that would move weapons, that would move illicit wildlife. So it seems like these illicit networks, there's a lot as far as moving them, the same way you move a diamond or a gold, maybe the same way that a rhino horn moves, or that you might be moving a person, human trafficking. And there's all this crossover in these illicit networks, which is fascinating to me as a human and as a writer. But so what have you? So this book came out in 2012, I think is when this published. What have you been doing since then? You've been working with traffic, and then you're the director of the Organized Crime Observatory for East and Southern Africa at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, which is that's a long title right there. Yeah, that's tough. That's tough to say.
I struggle on some days. Yeah,
but I've been to the website. It's amazing. I'm going to do a deep dive in there as I do research for future novels. But what does the path look like for you after the publication of this novel, and what are you doing today?
Yeah. So the work that I did with Traffic was focused very much on Eastern and Southern Africa. Traffic is an organization which monitors trade in wildlife, but particularly illegal trade in wildlife, to some degree legal trade too. It was set up around the same time as the CITES convention, which governs international trade in endangered species, came into force. So they do some really good on-the-ground research, looking at wildlife markets, looking at wildlife trade. I did quite a bit of work there with the team that I managed there, looking, for instance, at doing interviews with poachers to get a sense of the poacher economy, how poachers work. We looked at probably the most sort of clear-cut example of convergence or crossover between the drugs trade and wildlife trade in South Africa, which is the trade in abalone, this mollusk shellfish. Yeah. Which is widely traded in China, very heavily sought after, massive prices. But it ties the divers come from gang areas in Cape Town. The buyers use methamphetamine as a means of bartering. So either precursor chemicals to make methamphetamine, or they barter for abalone with gang bosses by providing methamphetamine. And it's led to a massive drug epidemic in parts of Cape Town. Huge meth problem, and Africa has a growing meth problem. So working on those kinds of issues, and also looking at how do we find community conservation solutions? Because ultimately, conservation again doesn't exist in a vacuum. It doesn't exist without people. You've got people living around national parks. You've got areas or habitat which is decreasing in Africa. So how do we create a balance where we've got people who can benefit from conservation, who can who can live around national parks, but will benefit from the fruits of those national parks in a way that can, end up preventing poaching, as we're seeing. Something again, which is quite worrying, given the economic fallout of the pandemic. Kruger National Park again, seeing massive uptick in snaring, bushmeat poaching by people who just simply looking for food to put on the table. So trying to find those solutions, I think ultimately, the solution that exists, or one of the key solutions to dealing with poaching, lies with rural communities who live around national parks and can protect those parks, but they need to benefit from those parks. And we've got to find ways of doing that. Then, beyond that, so the global initiative where I currently work now, so the global initiative was set up oddly enough, around the time this book came out. I went to their launch meeting in New York, 2013, at the UN in New York. The global initiative was set up at a time when there was a lot of debate, a lot of discussion going around. How do we tackle organized crime in a different way? We've been fighting the war on drugs for 30, 40 years. We've been, essentially doing the same thing over and over again. To try and combat organized crime. So how do we come up with innovative approaches? So that's the one element. So we work with communities on the ground. As another side, we've got a thing called the Resilience Fund, which supports communities in areas that have been hard hit by gang violence, organized crime. So in Mexico, we work with families of people who've disappeared there during the drug wars. Parents and mothers whose sons have been kidnapped by drug gangs or have been murdered by drug gangs. We work with communities in Southern Africa, supporting people doing research around violence, around political assassinations and hits. We've been doing quite a lot of work recently in northern Mozambique around the Islamic State-aligned insurgency there, and looking at those flows. So Mozambique, just to briefly sort of explain, northern Mozambique sits on some ancient trade routes which have existed for centuries along the Swahili coast, a very active trade, dhow trade, small dhows moving up and down the coast, up and down the Macron coast, moving various items. But it's also a drop-off point for significant quantities of heroin and methamphetamine increasingly coming from Afghanistan via Iran into northern Mozambique. So we've been tracking that for a very long time. And then we've been working, building up a database, building up information on drug prices, drug quality, the types of narcotics that we're seeing, doing sort of almost monitoring, which many governments are not doing. And what we're seeing is pretty disturbing in terms of use of heroin and meth in small town places. Not heroin previously was mainly big cities, but now you're finding it at truck stops. You're finding sort of dirty meth in Africa, in places where you'd never see meth before. So a lot of work on that. We've been doing some work in Somalia too, around arms shipments, weapons that are flowing from Iran into Yemen, into the conflict in Yemen, which are being rerouted into Afghanistan. Into Somalia. Those weapons being rerouted in Somalia, and the potential regional threat that poses too, with Ethiopia, which is now caught in the middle of its own civil strife. So it keeps us busy and out of trouble most of the time.
Wow. There's so many books there that you could write. I mean, I hope you delve into one of those subjects and write another book, because I mean, so talented and it's like, this one's fascinating, and I hope you do something in the future. Is that one of the ideas you're batting around?
Yeah, I've got a few. I think I think I'm at the point now where I've got a short list.
Okay.
I'm sort of battling between ideas to go, where are we leaning? So yeah. But I've been mulling a couple for, so I'm actually looking forward to doing another one. Yeah, absolutely.
Good. One a decade? Is that the pace that that we can look forward to? Or?
I think I need to work on that a bit. Yeah. Maybe get it up to, what you've done, 5 books since 2018. So maybe that's something I can aim for.
That'd be great, because I love this. I mean, it's such a great book, and thank you for what you're doing now. Like I said, that website, I'm gonna go do some deep diving in there for research for future novels, and just doing some amazing things. So thank you for writing this. And thank you for the work you're doing now. And I often get that question about, hey, from people in this country, how can I help combat rhino poaching in Africa? And there are so many different organizations out there, and some of them change, and then some of them disappear, and it's very hard for me to point towards one or two to at least point people in the right direction. But have there been a few that maybe you've worked with or heard of or know as legitimate, where if someone wants to help out, that they can research a little further?
Yeah, look, I generally, it's hard to sort of pinpoint one particular one. I generally sort of advise people to do a bit of background research, look at the organization, see the kind of work they're doing, the quality of work, and then decide. Unfortunately, there are quite a few sort of smaller fly-by-night groups, scam groups, but there's some, they're amazing organizations. Traffic, which I used to work for, they do really interesting work monitoring trade. There's Save the Rhino, who've been working very actively for years, the International Rhino Foundation. And then you've got, entities like the Wildlife Justice Commission, the Environmental Investigation Agency, who are actively doing investigations and amazing investigations in many cases into networks that are operating. So those are some of the bigger ones that are working there. You've got others, the Lowveld Rhino Trust in Zimbabwe, who for more than 20 years now, basically been keeping the wolves at bay and saving Zimbabwe's rhino population. Some really remarkable organizations. And, I think that's the one thing, I think the discussion we've had has been somewhat dark in some ways. This is quite a depressing discussion. But the thing that gives me heart is you've got, some of these really, truly amazing people out there who are putting themselves on the line, who've put themselves out there, who are dogmatically going at it day in and day out. They've been doing it for decades in some cases, who've devoted their entire lives to this kind of cause. And ultimately, I think if we can't save the rhino, something like as charismatic a species as the rhino, then what can we actually save? And what does that say about us as people in terms of how do we deal with the challenges that we face globally and so many challenges that are emerging every day.
Yeah, no, very true. I try to keep, try to stay hopeful. It's tough when you're getting bombarded with so many, negative inputs every day because of how we're connected. So but I try to remain hopeful. But thank you for remaining hopeful, having gone so deep into a lot of these things that are very, very dark.
Always about the people.
There we go.
It's always about the people.
That is true. Yeah. People in relationships, and hopefully moving that ball forward and making it, doing it better for the next generation. But man, thank you so much, and please don't make me wait another decade for another book. But please,
I'll do my best. Awesome. Yeah, thank you.
Welcome to the gear highlight portion of the Danger Close podcast. A couple things to go over here. One is this TG Knives. This just arrived from Scotland. Tom Garbett Knives up there. You may have seen one of his knives used by Christian Craighead, and if you don't know who that is, Google it. A lot of very cool pictures will pop up. Very interesting backstory. Cool guy. Anyway, this here is one that Tom sent over from Scotland, and this is the Sika knife. He has a few different blades out there, and man, these things are awesome. Check that out. Nice. Tom, thank you so much for sending this. Awesome. This thing is just legit. Thank you. Amazing. All right. What else do I have here? This book. Look at this Camel Trophy book right here. If you've been following me for a while, you know that I love what is now called overlanding. But this is so cool. I was always fascinated with camel trophy growing up. And I think it went from 1980 to 2000. This is a book, like a coffee table book that has all these amazing photos. Yeah, look at that. I always wanted to do this growing up. I remember in high school, I wanted to do one of these trips. They don't do it anymore, unfortunately, but maybe we can bring it back. Very cool. And let's see, at the beginning here, it says, between 1980 and 2000, Camel Trophy took more than 500 amateur adventurers from 35 different countries on extraordinary and challenging journeys through some of the world's most interesting places. On most of these events, teams drove specially prepared Land Rovers, taking them to the limit and beyond in some of the harshest environments known to motorized vehicles. Yeah, this thing. Very cool. All right, what else? And this. What? Oh, yeah. That's an action figure. So Patriot Force, these things are awesome. They do action figures for veterans, and then they put them on eBay, auction them off, and 25% of the proceeds go to the foundation of that veteran's choice. So for mine, it is Rescue 22 Foundation, foundation that provides fully trained service dogs for veterans suffering the physical and emotional trauma of the battlefield. So look at that. Looks just like me, huh? How about that? Oh, like a little G.I. Joe card on the back. Sick. All right. That is it for today. Thank you for tuning in to the Danger Close podcast, an Ironclad original presented by Sig Sauer. Follow Julian Rademeyer on Twitter at Julian, Julian Rademeyer, and also go to the website for the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. Link to that will be in the show notes. You can follow me at Jack Carr USA on the social channels. You can also go to jackcarrusa.com for the merch and officialjackcarr.com for the blog and more about the books and everything else. You can pre-order In the Blood right now. Until the next time, take care. Get this book. Read this book. Stay strong. Keep fighting.